Okay, and we're live.
We did it.
Welcome, everyone. I'm just turning my camera off. I'm very sorry that I will be just a talking, pulsating little image here this afternoon. My migraine condition has been quite awful this week. I've been forced to take on a lot more work and a lot of screen time, and it's just been a mess. So, self-protection means that I'll just be an image today, but I'm still very, very excited to get into this topic. So, as you probably know from the title, we'll be talking about all things birth control today. And I feel like this is a subject we can come at from so many different angles. And given the amount of, just horrid right-wing politics around the subject, and especially recently with attacks on, reproductive rights and reproductive justice, of course, we'll be talking about, the necessity of birth control and, why universal access is so important and how it's been very liberatory for people. However, we have a lot of other stuff to say too. Often the burden of birth control falls on the person who has a womb. And this is especially true in like cis and heterosexual relationships. And I think actually just me and Nick watched The Business of Birth Control, which we're going to be referring to a lot today, which was extremely eye-opening. And as somebody who has had a lot of issues with the birth control pill myself, it really, I think it's a really important watch, but we're going to be talking about a lot of the issues with the pill in particular, because that has always been kind of the standard go-to option and the one that often falls on the person who has a womb. There's also a lot of racist and eugenicist history of birth control and of sterilization. So as always, we're going to talk about, the history, the facts, the politics, but sprinkle in our own experiences, and definite content warning for themes of sexual assaults. We probably will talk about things like stealthing, for example. So yeah, do either of you have anything to jump in with before we dive in?
No, that sounds great. I think we can dive in.
All right. I thought we could start with the importance of it, just because, again, there are so many right-wing voices who are against birth control, but for very misogynist and oppressive reasons. A lot of people on the religious right, obviously opposing this. And so we don't want to, we're going to be critical of different kinds of birth control and like the history of the pill in particular today, but obviously we don't want to, echo or embolden any of those right-wing voices. We really can't understate the importance of the emergence of birth control. And I guess specifically the pill, because like I said, that was, kind of the standard, contraception form that women had increased access to. And I should say people with wombs in general. And this is something that I didn't even really know, that things like diaphragms or other forms of contraception were not actually available to people who weren't married. So basically only married women had access to diaphragms or things like that. And so if you weren't, then obviously you were, at a lot of risk. And so this was obviously a way for people to have more control over our bodies, something that we didn't need men's permission to do, right? So we could take control of it ourselves. And just have sex on our terms and not be like stuck or abandoned if pregnancy occurred, right? It's not out yet, but I just did a podcast with Dr. Kristen Godsey, who wrote Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. And a big part of that book is the way in which, people who have wombs or who can give birth, not having access to, contraception, not having access to abortion, also just living in societies that are much more unequal, etc. Just the injustice of this under capitalism, especially, right? So, I mean, we all know, like being forced to have a baby that you don't want to have is supremely unjust, but then also, just being left with that in this economy, and it really just takes away everyone's choice, and their ability to make their livelihood. So actually, according to a University of Michigan study, the availability of the birth control pill is responsible for roughly a third of women's wage gains since the 1960s. So it's it's about control over your body. It's about your controlling your own sexuality, but there's under capitalism, like there's so much more than that, right? Because again, if that is all, if the responsibility for child rearing is falling to you, especially in a situation where you didn't even choose this, then of course that's going to have like broader economic impacts. So again, I cannot overstate the importance. I wanted to also mention, like Kristen Godsey, that the availability of all that, like the availability of birth control, abortions, and then wider social safety nets, and just more equality in society in general, means that people with vaginas often have better and more satisfying sexual relationships anyway, and the orgasm gap can be addressed through those things. So many good things. Do either of you want to talk at all about the importance?
Just one thing to add, which would be that I guess it also helps us not get locked into marriage really young, because I guess a lot of people were kind of forced to get married to the first person you were ever interested in having sex with because you were so afraid that you would get pregnant. And I guess this allows us to spend years like choosing a partner, and hopefully then get to an age or life experience, or I don't know what, many factors that enable us to make better choices as we get older and have more experience. And I think, I feel like so many abusive relationships or unhealthy dynamics or traumas came from people having to get married so young, and then, getting locked into these unhappy permanent marriages, which often they couldn't get out of because of the stigma. So I think, that's a massive win. And also, I think we can be like critical about the about birth control without that necessarily meaning that the benefits don't outweigh, or the cons outweigh the benefits. I think, I don't know, there often seems to be this like it's like two extremes. Either you can only talk about the benefits or you can only talk about the cons, whereas like hopefully it can be a bit of a nuanced discussion where we kind of acknowledge both of those things, hold two truths at once. So,
yeah, I like that. And I think it's interesting to actually think about the cons and the context of them, because the pill, it is and was so empowering for women and people with wombs, so it kind of makes sense to me that there's this underlying nefarious sort of consequence, I guess, to that is very gendered and pretty intentional. So I think, as with many things, we can say, okay, this might be a net good, but the negatives of it are there for a reason. And I think it's really important for us to be able to talk about that and address that, and maybe have the ability to demand better for ourselves, which, like in that documentary, you saw some of that. You saw some of the activism that happened around the pill and how dangerous it was, and, some strives to make it better. So, I think I just agree with you, Kathrin. I think like having this very black and white approach to things like this is actually really harmful ultimately for the oppressed class, because it makes us adopt this attitude that we should basically be grateful for being given stuff that we should be given. And also that any and I hope you know what I mean by consequences. Like, obviously I don't mean that like not wanting to get pregnant is bad, but I mean that there are built-in kind of consequences, like, okay, you want to control your reproduction. Well, here's your risk of blood clot and stroke and all this other stuff. So I think, it's really important for us to see that. And also for those of us that have certain privileges to understand how other communities have been impacted by that, on top of like how we've been impacted ourselves. I think it's kind of silencing to other people to be like, well, it's a net good, so we can't critique it. Because then it's kind of like, oh, thank you, Daddy Patriarchy, for giving us this thing that killed a lot of people, And it's like, no, we can demand better. We can demand safer. And we can also look to what, cis men have gone through in terms of like any trials that they did for a similar pill or birth control solution for them were canceled because the side effects, which were basically identical to the side effects that we would have, were too extreme and they couldn't handle it. And it's like, okay, so like, what are we saying? What is that saying about our society and how we view people with wombs and our pain, So I think these conversations are extremely important. And it doesn't mean that we're somehow setting back feminism or reproductive control. It just means we're talking the truth about how all of this has happened and how it could be better.
Yeah, and also to your point about thank you, Daddy Patriarchy. I think it's really interesting that we're made to feel like we should be so thankful for this, as the pill is like liberation, because for so many decades, through like centuries in the Middle Ages, we had natural forms of contraception by witches and healers and herbal remedies and things like that. There were also natural forms of abortion that were functioning really effectively, and it wasn't until the patriarchy and the witch hunts and the like widespread genocide of women and getting rid of witches and not allowing them to be healers or to take charge of women's health, and then instead making like men the doctors and the medical knowers of what to do with our bodies, that all changed. So yeah, I don't think it should be a case of like, yeah, thank you, Daddy Patriarchy, since like the patriarchy was the thing that removed this from us in the first place. So yeah.
Yeah, that was really well said from both of you. And yeah, it's just obviously in a patriarchal and deeply misogynist and racist society, it's really important to talk about the ways in which, so often the solutions to whatever problem that we're talking about are carried out in racist and misogynist ways that then just kind of double down on these systems, right? So yeah, let's just get into the problems with the pill in particular. And again, I would definitely shout out the business of birth control. But yeah, I mean, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised at all to really hear about the history of how the pill was created. And even Planned Parenthood, which obviously, critical support for Planned Parenthood, especially during these times, as I mentioned, of these attacks on reproductive rights and freedoms. But the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, is a really controversial figure. Yeah, where to even start? So obviously she believed that, women and people with wombs really needed to control their own bodies in order to be free. But she also, was quite rooted in white supremacy and in other forms of, eugenicist kind of thought. She definitely thought that quote unquote undesirable populations could be reduced or eliminated by controlling their breeding. And the undesirable group that she mostly talked about was the mentally and physically ill, or people with disabilities, and also people living in poverty. And it just rings, really, it just sounds really close to, like Malthusians, basically, and other eugenicists. And so basically, she was working with Pincus, I believe, and trying to develop a birth control pill. And they knew that they couldn't really do the kind of testing that they wanted to do in the US. And they figured, oh, well, let's look around the world, right? Or let's look at Puerto Rico, that, the US is controlling. And there's a lot of people living in poverty there. So let's go do the testing there. And so the people that were being tested on were not told at all that this was an experimental drug. They really, were not given any information really at all, and were basically just used as guinea pigs. And about 1/3 of Puerto Rican women were sterilized, many involuntarily, under policies that pressured women to undergo hysterectomies and things like that. But the pill trial itself, 3 people died, and their deaths were never even looked into. So, and that was just kind of swept under the rug. Like the FDA was like, yep, it's fine. But the doses that they were giving to people in America were much less than what they had given to the people in Puerto Rico. But even still, like they kind of just glossed over the fact that this clearly had negative impacts on people during the trial. And then, of course, like over time, it started to come out that more and more people in the US were also developing similar problems, or it was leading to death in several cases. And I don't know if either of you have anything else to jump into about that, but again, it's just these things that we take as, I don't know, just unquestionably liberatory. Usually if you look into the history, like there is some form of, racist, eugenicist kind of nonsense behind it. And I just think it's just such a testament to like the enduring nature of white supremacy and patriarchy and whatnot, that like even our solutions end up replicating this kind of shit in like the most disgusting of ways. And only now is there really moves to try to like reckon with this. And I know that Sanger's name has been taken off of a lot of things associated with Planned Parenthood, and they've changed the name of a lot of the the awards that they give out and whatnot. But it's a pretty sordid history.
Yeah, it is quite sordid. And like you said, I don't know if I was surprised exactly, but it was a history that I had not heard before. Just like, oh, of course they did these things. Mm-hmm. But it's a weird thing, because I've known for a long time that I've had issues with the way that birth control, and yes, as someone asked earlier, we're talking about mostly the pill, as Mexie said, and birth control that would be prescribed to you is really mostly the topic today. I know I've had issues with the lack of information and transparency in that process, and also the over-prescribing, which I think we'll get to as well. So I knew all of that was bad, but knowing this like much darker history, just puts it in pretty stark relief that this is also why these things were not meant to necessarily be super safe, because you're talking about a population that you're literally targeting to reduce. Mm-hmm. So like, are you really going to care if the birth control is safe for them? No. Yeah. And even when it spreads out to the larger population, you're talking about loose young women, which are the most terrifying thing in, proper society. So again, it's like, well, if you have some people who get sick from this and we're not held accountable, but people know, then it's kind of like a nice deterrent or a punishment. Mm-hmm. So you're just talking about a lot of people where it's like they're not necessarily wanting you to be protected, even though this solution is being offered that seems liberatory. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as Kathrin said earlier, it's also one of the many times I think we see that we had ancient traditional wisdom around how to control these things in a safe way, right, from people we trust. That's taken away, and then it's replaced with a pharmaceutical, which we see happen a lot. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just wanted to add that there is such a long history of women's products not being tested properly. There was the Balkan Shield, which was a sort of IUD that maimed or destroyed many women from the inside. Some women lost uteruses from that. The Eshore was a device for sterilization, which led to so many side effects. It was eventually cancelled. But yeah, they've never really taken much accountability for these things. And then when it came to the pill, Barbara Seaman interviewed medical doctors about the pill, which prompted hearings called Nelson Pill hearings. But the women's movement crashed that in the 70s because the people giving evidence and the people talking and the doctors and everything, it was all very male dominated. So they were arguing that, you know, this isn't an accurate portrayal of actually what the impact that the pill is having, and this is very biased and not actually doing anything. So and that's basically been it. And then of course the Mexie, as you were saying, the history of legal sterilization of Indigenous and Black women in particular, and the classism involved in that. So there's like such a long history of birth control and products made for women based on birth control being used in these ways, and there's very little accountability taken for that. Or like you said, the fact that none of us really knew about this before doing this research just shows how much of a lack of knowledge there is about this. And then when we don't have knowledge about it, it means that history can so easily repeat itself, as we keep seeing. And the fact that we are taught to just to take this so uncritically despite this history, I think is incredibly sad. I also read this quote by Sanger that she wrote in 1920, just to hit home just how eugenicist her policies or her birth control was. She said, birth control is nothing more or less than the facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit and of preventing the birth of defectives. So
yikes. Yeah. And it's worth noting, I think, that these things are also not in the past. They still happen. You know, I know in the US we discovered that people were being forcibly sterilized at immigration detention centers, being given operations where they weren't told what was happening, and then they were being sterilized. So, I mean, this is just a couple of years ago. So this is still actively currently happening, which I think is really important. And Kathrin, to expand on your point too, there's things like tampons and sanitary napkins are full of pesticides. Cotton is one of the highest pesticide crops that exists. And so there's, you know, as my best friend Sarah says, forever chemicals in my vag. There's all kinds of wild shit that can be in things like tampons. And when you think about the fact that you're putting it inside yourself, where you have this very thin, you know, kind of porous skin, or whatever membrane, it's kind of horrifying. And it's this kind of slow war that we constantly see on, you know, AFAB bodies, if you will, where it's, you know, the cosmetics that we use and the sanitary things that we use, and that it's just this continuous pileup over just being exposed to these chemicals, these endocrine disruptors. And then we're told we're crazy, or we're making things up, or we're exaggerating when we go to our doctors and say, I don't feel right. You know, I'm in a lot of pain. I'm having migraines, or I'm having this or that issue. And we're told that nothing's wrong with us and to go home. So I think it's, you know, the birth control piece is like a piece of a larger whole, where it's hard as a person with like a vagina to not feel like you're just being sort of terrorized on a very micro level every day with even just the products that you use. And you have to, you know, that's what my friend Sarah is like researching stuff all the time. And she expends, I mean, the amount of labor she expends trying to find clean products to use is astronomical. And it's never what you think. I mean, the amount of research you have to do to know what's actually going into your body, you know, I mean, and that's an issue. It's a larger issue too, not just for people with wombs, but like it's exhausting, you know, and you just realize like you're just meant to put things in your body essentially, not knowing what they are, and just deal with the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that like literally and metaphorically.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, REIT happening today still. Yeah, in Canada, they are still, it came out last year, I believe, that they're still sterilizing Indigenous women in hospitals across the prairies, just across all of Canada. So yeah, this is not something that's happening in the past. Like this very Malthusian eugenicist kind of shit is still ongoing. And it needs to be part of the discussion. So yeah. So anyway, so yeah, after these, you know, not sound and completely unjust trials, and the fact that they covered up a lot of the actual side effects, you know, the FDA approved it, but it was only really approved for, you know, a short period of time. And the thing is that there's really no consensus on this. Like if you Google it, I Googled it before the stream, because I was like, yeah, how long can you be on the birth control pill? And a lot of people will say that like it should only be like a couple of years or whatnot. And we'll get into why. But then there's a lot of people who are like, oh, it's probably fine. Like there's no real, you know, there's no real kind of consensus. And there's a lot of things online that are just kind of like, well, you know, again, kind of like the benefits outweigh the cons, and you're probably fine to take it for a long time. Just be aware that these, you know, risks are associated with it. And then it's like, yeah, blood clot, liver tumor, stroke, heart attack, depression, you know, diabetes, you know, like all these things that are associated with it. Yeah, it's like I was on it for 11 years. 11 years.
That's such a long time.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to this because like I definitely have had a lot of issues with that. But again, yeah, it's just really frustrating that still, I mean, Nic, as you mentioned, you know, when tests like this happened for men, like cis men, and they had these similar kind of side effects, it was like, no, we're shutting this down.
Yeah.
And then still to this day, you can't even find reliable information on how long you can actually take this thing without seriously damaging your body. So yeah, so one of the biggest things that I took away from the documentary, and that this blew my fucking mind, is that when you are on the pill, you do not have a period. You do not actually have a period. And this just made me so angry because like this pill, this is prescribed to quote unquote regulate people's periods.
Yeah.
If you have any kind of irregular period or any kind of thing that's like, oh no, that's okay, we'll put you on the pill and it'll just regulate you. No, you're not actually having the period. You're actually just suppressing the entire process. You do not ovulate. And so initially when they gave out the pill, so for anyone who's unfamiliar, you know, you have 3 weeks of pills and they have different levels of hormones in them. And then the 4th week, you just have sugar pills. So it's called the placebo week or whatever. Initially, they did not include that placebo sugar pill week. And so people on it were not having periods. They weren't having bleeds, but consumers felt too weirded out by that. They felt like, oh, this can't be right. Like I'm just not having a period anymore. So the companies making the pills added the placebo sugar pill week so that people would experience a bleed. But basically it's just that, you know, you've been taking these hormones for weeks and then you withdraw. And that kind of mimics what happens before your actual period. And so it triggers a withdrawal bleed. So you're bleeding, but it's not the same as a period. Like you didn't ovulate. It's not the same process. You're not clearing that stuff out. You're just bleeding. And so this pacified people, but it's not the same thing. And so, yeah, it's like, okay, I mean, how many years can it possibly be safe to be suppressing your entire hormonal system? I mean, like, and yeah, recently I joined, like I read, well, I didn't read it, not yet, I'm going to, but I joined the group that goes along with the Period Power book. And just, I've learned a lot about, you know, cycles and the importance of cycles for people who have them, and like living according to that cycle. And just, you know, there's different points of your cycle where you're going to have more energy, where you're going to, you know, different things are going to happen to your body physiologically, and you're going to have different needs throughout like the month-long cycle. And one of the biggest issues with patriarchal capitalism is that it's designed for people without cycles. It's designed for people who have a biology where they basically experience that all within 24 hours. And so within the same day, you know, you'll just be able to kind of recoup and start again. And so everything is based on this idea that you should have the same amount of output at every point of your cycle, because it's not even paid attention to. But yeah, I mean, learning the importance of that, and the way that that interacts with all of your other hormones and your endocrine system, for example. I mean, everything is so intimately linked in people who have wombs and who menstruate. And so, yeah, it's just wild to me that people are on this thing for decades, not realizing that like they've completely disrupted their entire system. Like they're not actually having a period. Yeah, so for me, like my chronic illness, for anyone who doesn't know this as well, I developed a chronic illness over the course of like 10 years, and it had to do with a number of things. I did have a long-term eating disorder, which really stressed my adrenals and my endocrine system, led to migraines, led to insomnia, and eventually to like thyroid and like endocrine issues, like I said. But I realized that being on the pill for 11 years didn't help any of that, because also, you know, being on the pill affects how you deal with cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and it makes it more difficult for you to deal with that hormone, which is something that I was already struggling with as somebody who, had such elevated levels of adrenaline and cortisol in my body, from everything else that I was going through. So that did not help. And also the pill is an endocrine disruptor. So it affects your endocrine system. So I just can't imagine like how linked this was with my own issues. And what happened to me was that, over time, I started to have my bleeds were like 2 weeks long. And it was kind of wild. And I definitely ignored, like that was definitely a warning sign that everything in my body was breaking down. But I ignored that because, I had this eating disorder, and I kind of didn't want to address like the other things that were a problem, in my life. But knowing that like, this was happening to me. I was having like 2 week-long bleeds, and those bleeds weren't even periods. I was just literally bleeding. It just really messes me up. Like, I can't even tell you like how much damage that probably did. And then eventually, and my doctor never told me this whole time, she never said, hey, you should probably not be on the pill for like that long. Until my migraines got so bad that they were unmanageable. To like, I had been in the hospital, like I think, 3 times at this point. Like I had to go to Emerge because of my migraines. And then she was like, okay, we better take you off the pill because that can cause migraines. And like, oh yeah, you've been on it for a really long time, so you should probably come off anyway. And I was like, what the hell? Like, why was I not informed about this before? And also at the time, I feel like it's just been so normalized that like, that's the only option, especially if you're in a long-term relationship and whatever. It's like, well, the man's not going to do like, in a cis hetero relationship, it's like, well, the man's not going to do anything. Like if we don't want to get pregnant, then I have to take the pill, or we have to use condoms, which is like, we'll come back to condom politics, but it's just like, that's just intolerable for like a lot of men, apparently. And so I was like, well, what the heck am I going to do? Right. I mean, I guess we can come back to that as well, but like I was only taken off of it in this extremely dire moment. And only at that point did my doctor make any mention of the fact that this could happen and that I probably shouldn't have been on it for so long. But I just think about like all the people who are on it for even longer, all the like very young people who, like pretty soon after puberty, they're starting this thing that just suppresses that entire process. Like they've just developed that hormonal system and then they're completely suppressing it. And just like, what is that doing to people,
Yeah, I had a similar-ish situation because I was on the shot for a long time, which I really loved because I cannot remember to do anything on a regular basis. So whether that's take a pill, switch a patch, change my ring, doesn't matter. I'm bad at all of it. So this was like you go every 11 or so weeks and you get a shot, which was annoying. It was annoying to have to go get the shot, but like otherwise it's like, okay. And I felt really protected. I stopped having my period, which I thought was amazing. And I was on that thing for years. And I did have some side effects, which I tried to talk to my doctor about. And he told me it was impossible for me to be having side effects because I had lower estrogen than the pill. And I was like, but I am though. And also from like what I've seen online, it seems pretty well known that the shot has certain side effects, it's like, doesn't seem to be a big secret. So anyway, he was no help. But point is, I was on it for years and years. And then I got off of it for a time and then I went back on it later. And when I went back on it, I was told like I could only be on it for 2 years or something. I forget the length of time, but it was like, okay, you can do this, but you can only do it for so long. And I was like, no one ever told me that before about any of these things. These things were, and I was on birth control from 16 to 30, maybe even 30 or 2. I can't remember. I think I went off of it like right at my 30th birthday. And no one ever mentioned to me until, the end there with the shot that like there was even a time length to be considered. And after that time, so many times, because I had, different health issues, which interestingly, the more I discover and figure out, the more it's all seems to tie into cortisol and my inability to like handle stress physically. Which is interesting to think, okay, like how much did that play a part in that process? But, I was having a lot of issues with like extremely painful periods, extremely heavy periods, and I have like a massive history of endometriosis and things in my family. My sister just got a hysterectomy. My mother's gotten one. So it's like, that's there. And none of my gynos even ran any tests. They were just like, well, let's put you on birth control. And I'm like, even if that works, which it's not going to, it's not going to cure me, right? It's not a treatment. And even for most people, it may reduce your symptoms, but it doesn't get rid of them for the most part. So I'm like, even if it worked in terms of lowering my pain, you're not telling me what's wrong and we're not fixing it. We're masking it. So like, what is wrong with me? And is it a chronic condition? Is it a progressive condition? Because if I mask it and it's progressive, then it's just going to get worse without me knowing. And I think they said that in the documentary, it's like you mask your condition and it gets worse while you're masking it. And then you come off of it to like have kids or just get off birth control or whatever. And you're like, oh my God, like things are so bad. And this whole time when I could have been trying to address it, I just didn't know. And in that time, my body's been like falling apart. So yeah, I think again and again, for me, it's just the lack of transparency around birth control. It may have gotten better. I'm old now and I don't bother. But I, like for my entire lifetime, I felt like there was just a wild lack of transparency. And then also I definitely saw it go from, like, when I first got on birth control, the vibe very much was like, you're doing this to prevent pregnancy. And within my lifetime, I'd been offered birth control as a solution to so many other things, just very casually.
Yeah. To the point that I'm like, do they even know what it is, because like it's offered as a solution for so many things, and it's just like, do you know the implications of this? Like, I just kind of wonder that about some GPs, because it's just like, how can suppressing my entire hormonal system be a solution to any of these things?
Yeah, I also think it's crazy, and what can be so harmful about it is that most of us go on it at a time in your life where there are so many other changes anyway, and then like you're in a teenager or early 20s or whatever, and then people often think, oh, your negative effects like depression, anxiety, or whatever is like as a result of, oh, you're just a teenager, or you're a hormonal woman, or women are crazy, and all these like gendered stereotypes of us being overly emotional or whatever. And so then we internalize that, oh, these results are nothing to do with the pill, they're to do with like just me inherently as a woman, or because of these other life changes. Like, I went on the pill just as I went to university, so I was 18, and I like that those first few months of university, I was constantly, like, every night crying myself to sleep, and I was I don't know, it was a terrible time. It was a really, like, the whole year I basically didn't leave the room at all. And at the time I thought, oh, I'm leaving university, my boyfriend is back home, also the relationship is really unhealthy. I thought, oh, these are the factors, and maybe they could have contributed. But when I came off the pill years later, I was like, holy shit, I'm a transformed person. And now in hindsight, I'm like, how many of those changes were because of hormones, and how many were because of not hormones, how many were because of like life circumstances, and how many were because of the pill? And then also, even if the like those effects were because of like being a teenager, or other circumstances, is it really good when you're at such a pivotal time of life to go on the pill? Like, I'm sure it was initially made for, as you said, Mexie, for married people who wanted like a break in between children or whatever, and maybe you're in a more stable point of life. But if you're like a teenager and you're going through so many hormonal changes and life changes and whatever, it feels like a really bad time to like enter another thing that's like transforming your entire like hormones and everything. And also, it's crazy to me to think that like hormones are essentially your personality. And so I think Abby Epstein made that point in the probably cancelled like podcast, where she was like, hormones are your personality. And I was like, holy shit, that's so true. And then it makes you think, like, if this one pill like can change your whole entire personality for like a whole decade of your life, like, who would you have even been outside of that if you hadn't have taken that? And how many other choices would you have made if you hadn't been on that? And I don't know, it's just like really sad to think about such a pivotal time of your life, and how much it could have such a domino effect to other things in the future, like you with chronic illnesses, and so many other things. Anyway, I also wanted to say that the thing that really blew my mind as well, which I think it was in the Period Power book that I read, was that the pill actually mimics the second half of your cycle. And like, for anyone who doesn't know, the second half of your cycle is basically like PMS. So the first 2 weeks of your cycle is generally when you feel pretty good, or especially like the second week, where it's often associated with excited hormones and happy, and you feel so much better. And then like the PMS part is where everything goes to shit, and you feel like shit, and you have like stress, and often you're feeling down and sad and all of these things. And so if the pill is essentially mimicking the second half, that means that like you're not getting the benefits of the first half of your cycle, and you're just replicating the part of your cycle that you actually want to like not have. So it really makes sense to me that everyone's feeling like shit on the pill if it's mimicking the part of your cycle that sucks. And also what I learned from the Period Power podcast and the book in general was how much like our cycles are actually like such a powerful thing as the like title of the book suggests, and like how much if you listen to your cycle, like how much it can like transform your life. And I don't know, she talks about things like in the first 2 weeks can be a time for you to like really be energized and really have so many new ideas and you get into projects and like really have that momentum and that confidence. And then the second 2 weeks are the time when you like take more introspection, and often like the rage and the hormonal like sadness and the things that you're feeling at that time can be helpful because it can enlighten you to the things in your life that you want to change, and all the pent up emotions from those 2 weeks from the whole cycle like come to a head towards the end. And like I, for example, like the day before my period, I usually always cry, and it's like a great way to release like all the things that have come the month, and like I feel like a new person when the day after. And I don't know, it's just sad that, well, firstly that we've become so removed from listening to the wisdom within our cycles, and also like living in tune with our cycles. I think Mexie, you mentioned that earlier as well. But secondly, also if we're not only not in tune with our cycles, but also disrupting that to such an extent that like, I don't know how much knowledge and wisdom and like self growth and all of these things could we be capable of if we had a deep like intuitive like connection to our cycles and like lived in tune with that, and also didn't have something suppressing that. I don't know, I mean, me now really paying much more attention to my cycle and trying to spend my days in accordance with like what my body actually wants, it's really been transformative to, I mean, not to say that I'm like perfectly doing everything in accordance, because obviously like life doesn't allow that, but yeah, it's so much more powerful to recognize like, oh, okay, this is the time of my cycle, this is why I'm feeling like this, and this is the time of introspection, so let me like think about that. Or this is the week where journaling would be really good because there's so much like that I need to process right now. Or, and I know also like my exercise, like, oh, there's no way I'm exercising at this week, but in 2 weeks time I'll be so excited to exercise. And okay, someone wants like to do a hike with me, I'm not going to do it this week, but 2 weeks time, that's a good hiking time, you know, like, I don't know, it's just, yeah. It's just I just can't get my head around the fact that like it's like a permanent PMS if you're on the pill.
Yeah, that is really concerning to me.
Yeah. I wanted to add into this because I don't think it fits cleanly anywhere in particular, but there's also I guess some kind of irony or something in that the pill for a lot of people too reduces your libido.
Yeah.
And I know for me, the puss was much wetter after I went off the pill. So there's also this idea, like we all know how much, as like particularly in a cishet dynamic, that things like you getting wet reflects on your partner, right? And there's a lot of pressure around being not just sexually available, but being excited about it and having your body reflect that. And I think there's just something to the fact that, again, you're given this thing that's supposed to help you have pleasurable, lower risk sex, but that is possibly impacting your enjoyment or even your desire for sex. And that's something that no one ever talked to me about. When any time that I was given birth control, no one ever talked about those potential consequences. So there's that. And then I also think that I think what really highlights the fact that the pill is still to this day not truly intended to be liberatory I'm not saying it's not, but I'm saying like the powers that be do not intend it to be, is the fact that you cannot voluntarily sterilize yourself as a person with a womb if you haven't had many children, or you're not at an age where they're like, you're disgusting and decrepit, so fine, we might as well.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can find a doctor who will do it, but most of the time you cannot find a doctor who will allow you to do tubal ligation if you haven't had. Even my sister has been begging for a hysterectomy for years because her endometriosis was so bad. And when they went in and finally did it, all of her organs were like stuck together.
Oh my God.
And she's lucky, but they were worried that they were going to have to like cut into her bladder, and that she might have, to heal from that or even have permanent damage from that, because it was just, everything was all stuck together. Ugh. And so she knew this, right? Like she felt that this was happening, and it was extremely painful, and it was happening for years and years and years. And she was begging to have a hysterectomy. And my sister has 3 kids, 3 fucking kids. And they were still like, no, you're too young.
Oh my God.
What if you want to have another kid? And she's like, I don't even know if I can anymore. It was like the endometriosis was to the point, even the 3 kids she had, it was extremely painful. She almost died with one of the births. She had a ton of miscarriages. So she's like, yeah, maybe I would like to have more kids, but just realistically, I can't risk it. I don't have the, I don't have the strength to go through that again. And I'm telling you, this is what I want for myself. I want my uterus. I think they took her uterus and her fallopian tube. She's like, I want it gone. And they fought her, even though she had a very clear medical need for it. And she had actually already had multiple children. They still were like, oh, poor little woman. What if you want to have more babies? And she's like, how even?
Oh my God.
Would I even do that? So yeah, it's, I think that really highlights, the fact that like how little control we're truly given over our own bodies, because I wanted an IUD, which is very hard to get if you haven't been pregnant. There is some valid reason to that, because apparently it's like a size thing, so if you've been pregnant, I think things stretch a little bit, even if you aborted or miscarried, which make the IUD easier to insert, but it can be done. And I also think like if there was a vested interest, I'm sure something could be developed, that would make it easier. So yeah, even getting something like an IUD where it's there and you don't have to think about it is really hard. And then getting, more permanent sterilization is next to impossible for a lot of people of a certain age, especially if you haven't had kids yet. And it's just, as someone who's known since I was like a tween that I do not want kids, it's been so frustrating and forced me down this path of hormonal birth control for 14 plus years.
Which is so fucking damaging.
Right.
And to me, like,
whereas if I was 18 or 20 and I could have gotten, a tubal ligation, then I would have been able to avoid all of that.
Yeah. And it's really gross that like I didn't even know that. And learning that is especially gross to me, because I know that they will give vasectomies to men at age 20.
I'll hand them out.
Yeah, because in the vegan movement, remember all these men getting vasectomies at like age 20?
Yes.
There was a whole movement.
I do remember that.
Like it's like an antinatalist like vegan movement. And all these guys like in their early 20s, even like late, I don't even know, like maybe not late teens, but yeah, definitely early 20s, getting vasectomies and then talking about it and promoting it to other people. And you're telling me that like, yeah, somebody who has 3 kids, but
who's married with 3 kids,
who's
disabled, who's in pain, can't just get a fucking tubal ligation. Or a hysterectomy. Yeah, it's ridiculous. So Celeste says, again, you have to remember I'm old, but Celeste says there are little IUDs now for people who never gave birth. And
thank God.
Yeah, they were able to get one in France 3 years ago. And I do, to be clear, like I have a friend who was able to get an IUD without having been pregnant. But the point is, like, if you go in and you're like, my cramps are kind of bad, they're like, pill. Do you want the pill?
Yeah.
Whereas if you go in and you're like, I want a more permanent, reliable solution to controlling my reproduction, it's a bigger fight. But I'm glad to see, because that's exactly what I was thinking. I'm like, why don't they just have a smaller one then?
Yeah.
You know, like, that would solve the problem.
Yeah. Also, to your point about the libido, I also found it really fascinating that the pill can really impact your choice of men as well. Apparently, when you're off the pill, you're into more masculine men generally, and when you're on the pill, you're much more into like more like quote unquote feminine men.
So is it Timothy Chalamet because we're all on the pill?
Oh my God, I'm obsessed with Timothy. Oh, I love him. I've been watching so many YouTube videos of him, like just talking. Yeah. Anyway, so estrogen is known to nudge our preferences when it comes to romantic partners to favor qualities associated with masculinity and higher testosterone. And I think it was in the Period Power book again, where I believe she gave an example of a woman who was engaged to a man and then went off the pill and then broke off her engagement because like the impact was so strong that no longer being attracted to her partner. And so like these things can really have like a big impact in terms of your attraction to people and things like that. And I think that's like that's really crazy to me.
I don't know about the like higher testosterone stuff because like I mean when I was on the pill I feel like I made very poor decisions with men who would be considered more like alpha losers, and then off the pill I make much better decisions. So I don't know about like masculinity and whatever, but I do know that like when you're on the pill, it affects your ability to like smell pheromones. So, because like usually what does attract you to somebody is like their pheromones and their smell. And that's kind of like a subconscious hormonal thing that goes on, but the pill disrupts that process because it disrupts all of your hormones. And so, I have heard that as well, that people will go off the pill and then be like, I actually don't like you.
Oh, brutal. It's like, you know what? I'm horny. The piss is wet. And I'm not into you. So I'm going to take it somewhere else. Goodbye. And the last thing I wanted to add, just going back to the vegan men who are getting vasectomies, because that was such a thing. I also remember reading one of those posts from one of the guys, and he was talking about how he didn't use condoms because he was like zero waste.
Oh my God.
And so he had this vasectomy, and then he would pick his partners like who were low risk and then would just have unprotected sex with everybody.
Great.
And it was like,
wow,
this is where we are as a movement.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Oh God.
Oh, that's crazy.
Oh, it's terrible.
I also, another thing that blew my mind when it came to the pill is that being on the pill closely mimics what it's like to have menopause. And so like your hormonal,
that does not make me excited.
Your hormonal situation like is like you're on menopause, which is that's crazy.
Wow. Well, no wonder we're all cranky and naggy and tired and
well, I mean, like the libido things. I mean, it makes so much sense, Kathrin, when you describe that it mimics the luteal phase of the cycle, because that's when, like, usually in the first 2 weeks when you're building up to ovulation, that's when you're like really up for it. Like you're really out there, you're excited, like like you're down for it. But like after, like, because that's after the ovulation, everything's kind of shutting down. You're going back inwards. Like, you don't want to be touched. You don't want to be whatever. And so, I just think, I mean, and there's so many other, things that can affect, it can, you know, we talked about mood, it can affect your weight, like your heart and lung function, and all of this stuff. And so, yeah, it's just really perverse where, this like burden falls to people with wombs, and then you're dealing with all of this, and then you're also, yeah, trying to have like a satisfying relationship when your hormones are all messed up, you can't smell pheromones, your libido is whack, you know. And this is basically like all because, yeah, as you said, like the other options that are good, like IUDs, like I had an IUD for many years, and it was amazing. Because I didn't get the hormonal ones, because like after being on the hormonal one for 11 years, I was like, I cannot go on any more hormonal shit, but they do have a copper one. And so getting a non-hormonal IUD, I know that like some people have discomfort with it. Not everyone likes it. Kathrin, you brought up that like, you know, there were ones that they were not testing that like actually like maimed people. So, you know, that's really fucked up. But yeah, I mean, like if that was available for people, I mean, like if there was different options that weren't so disgusting and severe that were available, but I mean, condoms are available, you know? But it's like, yeah, like because like, you know, some men don't like that, or they're like, oh, it affects my sensation or whatever. It's like, oh, okay, well, in that case, I guess I'll just suffer, you know, developing chronic illness, like having all of these side effects related to my mood, my libido, my health, everything, and potentially risking much more severe things like blood clots, strokes, and death, because you would rather not wear a condom. And
yeah, that's crazy. It's so crazy that like a momentary lesser pleasure, still pleasure, just a little lesser pleasure, is seen as more significant of a problem than all of the above that you just said.
Yeah.
Oh, that's crazy. It's so crazy.
Yeah. No, it's really upsetting, because then it's like, because like that's the whole thing, like where this is why it was considered so liberatory for women in the 60s, because it's just like, oh, finally we can have sex now without the risk of pregnancy, because it's like it's just assumed that oh, well, yeah, we can't use condoms. And I remember like growing up that there was such like a lot of pressure placed on young people with wombs, or like young women in hetero relationships, to not wear a condom, because I mean, we've talked about many times on this channel that we're very, very taught to prioritize male pleasure, prioritize the male gaze, and that we need to like compete sexually. And so, you know, if you're trying to like get with this guy and he's, you know, you're not an interesting sexual partner if you make him wear condoms. Like he'll want to go find someone else who won't, or whatever. So there's a lot of like just subtle ways that people are pressured into it. And so it's like, oh, finally we have the pill. So this is liberatory for us, because now we can assume the risk and discomfort and still prioritize male pleasure, but like be able to have sex more without, you know, hopefully without getting pregnant. But it's still just like a prioritization, like it's still based on this prioritization of male pleasure that we're now assuming the risk, you know, and that's liberatory for us.
Yeah, I also think that like historically, like women are always victim blamed for like men attacking us and you know, assaulting us. And I think this is just like another example where, you know, we're taking on all the responsibility for warding off men's advances and resisting them. And yeah, we constantly have the responsibility of like, oh, us being the ones to make sure that like men wear the condoms, and we have to if they don't wear a condom and we get a disease or we get pregnant, then that's our responsibility, because we weren't like effective enough at like warding them off. And then, or like, you know, convincing them to wear the condom and not allowing them to coerce us into not wearing a condom, and that's all our responsibility. And then that allows us to allow men off the hook when they leave us with the baby. It's like, well, you were the one that decided to have the baby, you were the one that should have been more responsible about taking the pill or using condoms, getting him to use a condom. So you're the one responsible. So we're not going to blame the guy for like fucking off. It's your responsibility. And instead we're like, oh, what a great guy if he like sticks around when you chose to have a baby that he didn't really want. It's like, yeah, the double standards, I think, are crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's so much around condoms that we could talk about, but we were talking about this in Discord yesterday because I did a little streaming party for the documentary. And there are legitimate, like, I don't like condoms. I think a lot of people with vaginas don't like condoms, or a lot of people who get penetrated don't like condoms. So that's also irritating to me because it's like, well, yeah, it's not my ideal either. I find condoms very drying, which I'm sure a lot of people do, or maybe it's just my spicy mix. But like, so it's like, they're not, for a lot of people, they're not ideal, but what are we talking about here? Like, when we're weighing all the pros and cons, what is a lower ask for you to wear a condom, or for me to permanently change like my hormonal makeup? And like, even for myself, it's like, would I like to raw dog it? Sure. But like, I don't want to get pregnant. I don't want to get STDs, whatever the case is. Like, this is just the best option. And it's the one that we can both see. We both know, we have transparency into it. And there it is. But what I was going to say is that, we've talked about like our masturbation episode. I think that's worth listening to, because I do think the way that people masturbate makes a big difference on whether or not they like how they feel about condoms. Because if you think about, if you're masturbating to the point where even a bare vagina, well, I guess you're bare, but you know what I'm saying? Like, even unprotected sex with a vagina is not enough. Like, it's still very hard for you to get off. Then, like, yeah, of course you're going to feel nothing with a condom. So I think there could be some education around sensitization and getting to a point where you're not feeling nothing with a condom for those people that's even true for. And then there's just I don't think people realize, like, it's really hard to find the right size condom.
Yeah.
And also people have like a lot of different preferences for like texture, or like, I'm very sensitive to chemicals. So like any of the added flavors or the warming lubricants, like all of that stuff is very irritating to me. So I think, like, because I know the first person I had P&V sex with, it took us a while. We actually thought he was having impotence problems because he couldn't like hold an erection. And eventually we figured out it was because the condom was the wrong size. And once we found a brand that fit properly, he was fine. So I think that I guess, to give people a little bit of grace and leeway. I hate that word, grace. Everyone says it now, and now I say it, and I'm like, I fucking hate that word, and it's like in my head. Anyway, side tangent. But to give people like a bit of credit, again, I think like when we talk about sex, we always need to be like as open as we can, and like as educational, and just allowing people to speak. And I think like condoms can be very uncomfortable, and they can be very awkward, and they can like cause issues.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean, like, that means that we need to troubleshoot. It doesn't mean that we need to pressure people into unprotected sex or force them onto reproductive control methods that are going to make them feel like shit.
Yeah.
And so, I wish we could have better conversations about like, okay, the way you masturbate might be impacting your sensitivity. And like, you may have to go through several different sizes and brands before, and thicknesses and all kinds of stuff before you find something that works for you. And given that condoms are kind of expensive, it's like, okay, can we give them out for free? Can we give people like some kind of big ass multi-pack that they can play with and figure out which one is the best for me? Because all of that makes a huge difference. And I think the way that, penis size has so much pressure on it, I think that can make it hard for people
Mhm.
too who maybe need a smaller condom,
Yes.
or you know, in the case of my ex, not to brag, but he needed a bigger condom, and he had this, like, he almost had like body dysmorphia about his penis, because he just was like, he couldn't wrap his head around the fact that he needed a bigger condom, because he's used to, like, you know, 14-inch hogs and porn, that being like big. And I'm like, babe, no, like, you're working with a fair amount, you know, we need a bigger condom. But I think, like, you know, because of that, that also makes it really difficult for people to just be able to be honest. And like, it makes, like, if you need a smaller condom, I'm sure it makes it harder to go buy them. At
Mhm.
least today, it's much easier. You can just order them online for a lot of people. I guess that would probably help. But yeah, I think, you know, condom use, I get it. It's embarrassing. I know I've had a lot of partners who are kind of like, maybe don't really know how to put the condom on properly, and I offer to help, and they're like embarrassed. You know, there's just so much awkwardness and embarrassment around it. And I do think it's the kind of thing where guys feel like they're supposed to just be able to do it and kind of know what to do. But it can be more complicated than that. And it
Mhm.
can be okay. Like, it is awkward. It's
Yeah.
fine, you know, but, and that can be normalized, but we don't, you know, it's supposed to
Mhm.
be, I think, especially when we look at like sex scenes, I am constantly just like, where is the condom? Like,
Yeah.
constantly when I watch things, I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Just shocked at like how often, and it's not to be judgy, but it's also like, I think it perpetuates this idea that safe sex is not sexy.
Yes.
And, you know, it's just like the idea we have about consent. Like, if you talk about things beforehand, they're not sexy. So we also don't see that in any of the sex scenes. And
Yeah.
when you get that over and over and over, it does condition you to think, oh, well, I'm going to ruin the mood if I like need help with the condom.
Mhm.
You know, because even putting the condom on is considered like kind of like a pause in what's happening, and it
Yeah.
could potentially ruin the mood. So there's just so much, like, if we could have media have better representations of safe sex, because that is also consent too. Like, when I see a scene where two people just start banging, I'm like, okay, like, it does seem consensual, but at the same time, like, he doesn't know if she's on the pill.
Mhm.
Neither one of them know their STI status. Like,
Yeah.
this is a little concerning.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought all of that up. And yeah, I'm really glad that you also brought up that, like, yeah, of course, like, condoms often don't feel great for people with vaginas either. You know, like,
I
yeah.
can only imagine with anal.
Yeah.
Girl, it
Yeah.
must be 100 times worse. I
Right.
will say I have had sex with condoms sometimes that has been great.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes weirdly, everything works really well.
Mhm.
So it can happen,
Yeah.
but you know, most times it feels less great than without.
Yeah.
But
Well,
that's just
yeah.
part of it.
Like, yeah, and the stuff about like the size and brand and everything, because yeah, I definitely have had you know, some really great experiences where, yeah, you know, it was like smaller and more tight, and like I,
Mm-hmm.
you know, maybe had some like texture or whatever, so then it kind of like mimics or whatever. So that's been very nice. But yeah, and I agree. I was just like, there's so many dudes I think who are just like, oh, I need a large or I need an extra large or whatever. And then like, yeah, it's
Like,
like,
oh, sweetie.
yeah, but then it's like hanging off or it's like bunching up. And then like, of course that's not going to feel good. That's going to feel super, you're going to be
Not
hyper
to
aware of
mention
that.
that's dangerous and
Right.
ruining, like, it's besides the point at that point, you know?
Exactly. But yeah, like if it's something is bunching and whatever, then you're gonna hyper fixate on that. You're not. It is gonna take you out of the experience.
Yeah.
So yeah, we need to get over this whole like penis size everything around that. And just like you said, like yeah, like what is the bigger ask here? Like, because yeah, it's like this is a choice that we're making together. And like yeah, we need to weigh, you know, what is being asked of each person, right?
Yeah.
And someone in the chat said like, I don't understand men who don't want to wear condoms, like they're risking getting an STI as well. And I also never understand that, you know, like but I guess they're like, well, whatever. And I think maybe a lot of them don't really take care of their health because, like, yeah, there's so many men who are just like out on the dating apps and like, yeah, they do not want to wear a condom, you know, and they will be very vocal about that. And it's like, what? Like, what are you talking about here? You know, like you're risking yourself, but you don't care, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason I initially went onto the pill was actually because me and my boyfriend at the time were using condoms, but they kept splitting. And in hindsight, I'm really frustrated by our lack of knowledge or the lack of knowledge we were given or about like different types of condoms because yeah, I think the condoms were too small at the time, and that's why they were splitting. I've never had that issue since. And yeah, and I think to myself, yeah, if only we had just like got like bigger condoms or like more, yeah, better fitting condoms, we would have, then I wouldn't have gone on the pill because I would have been like, okay, we can continue using condoms and this is yeah, working fine for us. But yeah, there's such a lack of like information or knowledge. I also think in a similar vein, like so many people go on the pill to make sure they don't have periods. Like I know we talked about the withdrawal bleed, but I had so many friends who would take the 3 weeks back to back to back to back so that they would never have
me too.
periods, and so then they wouldn't have yeah, so they would never take the like sugar pill versions, and it was all basically just to make sure that their boyfriends never had to have sex with them on their periods or that they never had to turn down, well, I shouldn't say periods, it's like not a period, it's withdrawal bleed, but so they shouldn't have to turn their boyfriends down on the period because they're like, well, yeah, I don't want my boyfriend to be frustrated that I'm not always down to fuck, or the whole like cool girl trope or manic pixie dream girl or wanting to fit into that mold. And so yeah, it's like so great for them if they're like, oh yeah, my boyfriend never has to see me ever having a period, never has to deal with any of that like stuff, and that would be off-putting, so I'm never gonna I'm never gonna be with him when I'm on my when I'm bleeding. And I think like that just really frustrates me because okay, I think people can have their preferences about whether they like period sex or not, but I do think a lot of the time men's aversion to periods comes from like patriarchal conditioning around like how gross periods are, but also our own lack of desire for like people with wombs having sex on our periods also comes from internalized patriarchy sometimes. I mean, sometimes it's like, you know, you don't enjoy it or it's painful or whatever. Like there's, like I said, there's many valid reasons not to want to, but yeah, if we've just internalized this disgust for our own blood and then we feel like we have to cater to men by like not having sex or like making sure we don't have any kind of blood whatsoever ever, but like what kind of impact is that having? And I remember one of my friends, she said, yeah, like my doctor said it was perfectly fine for me to like do the 3 weeks back to back to back, there's no problems, and she was permanently doing that, and I'm like, whoa, like like what impact does that have? And the doctor was saying that's fine.
Well, honestly, now that I know that it's like it probably is fine, you know, because like the whole
right, it's probably not
like,
worse.
like yeah, exactly, because that's how they initially released the pill, was just they didn't have the placebo week. That was only done to pacify people and to sell it to them because people didn't want to buy it because they were like, well, this can't be right. Because yeah, none of it is right.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to point out earlier, Koch made a joke about killing the word libido.
Yeah, I saw that.
Whenever I use the word libido, I am using it kind of sarcastically, but I know that you all are not actually inside my head, so you can't know that. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that because I know we have some ace people on the stream as well. And yeah, the concept of libido has its issues, and you know, there's probably better words, but also I just think it's kind of a funny word.
It is funny.
I don't actually know what is the issue with libido.
I think the big thing is that, you know, for ace people who just never want to have sex, there's this kind of tension between like when we talk about libido, often we're talking about like everyone should have this desire.
Oh, I see.
You know what I mean? And there's also a little medicalization of asexuality. So a lot of times people are trying to find the medical reason that you don't have a quote unquote libido. So I think that's it's kind of like I think it's tied in a little bit to sex drive as well, even though that's more specifically problematic in a patriarchal sense. But it's this idea that we're all supposed to have sexual desire, and that sexual desire is sign of like a healthy, well-functioning body. So I wanted to say, yeah, I probably shouldn't. I know I used the word first, and I probably shouldn't have, but in my head I'm always like libido, because it is a funny word, and it's also just a funny concept. But yeah, I guess we could say sexual desire for people who have sexual desire. It's something that can be impacted by birth control. But for people who don't, that's fine too.
Yeah.
And there could be people where it removes their sexual desire, and that's fine by then. It doesn't have to be seen as a bad thing.
Yeah, I also just wanted to finally say as well that another thing I wish there was more education on was like, I constantly went on and off the pill, but like in like 3 months, I would be on it for 3 months, then off for 1 month, then on it for 2 months, because
I used to do that a lot too.
Yeah, because
or I would just be really bad about taking it.
Oh god, yeah, that too. Yeah, no, I never remember to take it every single day. And and then sometimes I take 2 pills thinking that which now I know like doesn't actually do anything if you take 2 in one day. But yeah, because I was in a long distance situation, and so I was like, oh yeah, I'll just take it when he's here, and then like not. But it's just no, like in hindsight, I'm like, oh my god, like how crazy the hormones must be to be on it sometimes on it and not. Also, can we talk about the morning after pill? Like, I didn't do any research on the morning after pill for this like stream, but I've taken it twice in my life, and it was really like it really fucked me up for that time. And I know that it's supposed to be even more harmful than like the pill itself. Also, it's so expensive, like £26.
So expensive.
I mean, I think it's even more in the US, right? And yeah, and that like hormonally, I was all over the place. It really made me like almost suicidal being on that pill. It was,
wow.
Yeah.
I took it once in my life, but I don't remember having anything. But yeah, I don't know much about it, like in terms of like, yeah.
It's a higher dose. It's like a more concentrated dose, which is why it works. But if you have issues with hormonal birth control, it's gonna be exacerbated. Like it's gonna be whatever issues you have are gonna be even more so because it's a higher dose.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's pretty intense, and yeah, it's very expensive here. I think it's like the last time I took it, I think it was like $40.
Wow. It was free for me, but.
It should be free. All this shit should be free. Everyone's always griping about like poor people having kids, and I'm like, hello, I've been asking to be sterilized for years. Like, give it to me for free. Give me a tax break.
Oh god.
But yeah, it's and it's another thing that I think it's very similar to the pill that we're talking about, or like any other hormonal birth control, where on one hand, of course, it's extremely empowering, liberating, whatever. It gives you even more control over your situation. But on the other hand, it also still puts even more responsibility on you. And this time, like, well, I guess it's always kind of financial, but this just feels like even way more so because you're not going to get your insurance to cover it. Whereas with birth control pills, like maybe you would. So, like now we have all these rom-coms and stuff where it shows them going together and they like split the cost or whatever. The guy pays for it. But in a lot of situations, you might be left to have to go get it yourself. And so you're like, wow, okay. Like now I suddenly have this, $40, 26 pound, what have you, obligation that I have to go do to protect myself. And yes, it's cheaper than an abortion. But like here I am, I'm just, again, because I know a lot of guys who are like, oh, like she'll just take the morning after pill or whatever. Well, I'm not friends with people like that, but I mean, it's like a thing that you hear. You know, so it's like just yet another way for someone to not put on, you know, I said condoms are expensive, but in the grand scheme of things, they're very cheap compared to a lot of these other solutions that people with wombs have to get. Because even with birth control, like I think my copay was always like $25, which is not a lot, but I also used to be extremely poor, and that was a lot of money. And, you know, condoms would, I don't know if they would, where they would average out. But anyway, it's like, it's much cheaper for you to carry a pack of condoms on you than it is for me to always be on birth control so that I'm always protected. Because like Kathrin is saying, it takes at least 1 month or like one cycle for birth control to kick in. So you have to always be on it to be protected. Or you have to do the morning after pill, which is very expensive and also very physically, you know, it's a lot. Where was I going with that? Anyway, yeah, I just think it's another way that like people with wombs are burdened with preventing pregnancy, where you can just have that happen. While I will say they are great. I had someone actually, I don't know, it wasn't stealthing exactly, but he like ejaculated inside me without asking if it was okay. And very much like wanted me to get pregnant. And so he refused to help pay for the morning after pill.
Oh my God.
So I had to bear that cost myself, but I was able to go get it. You know what I mean? Like I was able to make that decision for myself, even though I had to bear the cost of it. At least I was able to prevent that from from him forcibly impregnating me, basically. And of course they broke up with him right after that. But it just, even then, you know, it's just this I always think about cost because I'm, you know, poor and grew up poor, and it's like, yeah, these things are great, but also there's a class barrier, there's a cost barrier. And if you're someone who, like, I've had times in my life where I just did not have $40, period. I didn't have a credit card that I could have charged it to. I didn't have it anywhere. I didn't have anyone I could borrow it from. So you think like, oh, it's irresponsible to get pregnant when you have these options, but it's like, not everyone has those options though, really.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up like the class character of all this, because like, yeah, during, you know, all of these right-wing attacks on abortion and reproductive freedom and stuff like that, you know, you'll hear a lot of people being like, oh, well, if you're not ready to have a kid, then don't have sex. You know?
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, okay,
talk about a pleasure gap, Jesus.
Yeah, but it's like, okay, so like poor people, I mean, yeah, like try actually raising a kid in this economy, A, but B, it's like, okay, so poor people should just never have sex. Like, is that what you're saying? Like people who don't want children should just never experience that kind of intimacy and pleasure with their partner? Like what the hell are you talking about? And yeah, so like the fact that abortion is often so expensive, I mean, again, luckily in Canada, it's covered. But yeah, but you know, I know in the States, a lot of places, like it's so expensive. And then all of these things can be really expensive again, if you live somewhere where it's not covered. So it's like, you know, like not only is it, you're like, well, I don't have the funds to bring a kid into this world. So I need contraception. And then the contraception itself is like, you know, has like a class barrier to it.
Yeah. And as Celeste mentioned, like rape exists too. You know, it's not like it's always consensual or voluntary either. And like that doesn't mean you shouldn't have access to options.
Yeah.
I also think it's crazy that the burden in like heterosexual relationships is always on like women to be the ones to be negotiating safer sex, because historically we've had like no power when it comes to sex, and I mean still today we don't have like the power in those situations. So
if anyone should be empowered to be the ones to like be instigating like safer sex, like it should be men that should be at the forefront or being taught how to do these things, and like instead of us having to be the ones that have to negotiate that, because it's just like the constant negotiation of like not only trying to avoid sexual violence, but then also like trying to like make sure that you're having safer sex at the same time. And then because of sexual violence, it's often so hard to negotiate like having these like birth controls, because it's like sometimes it's easier just to not mention a condom, because it's like I'm not sure this person will wear a condom, and I don't want to deal with the emotional effects or the like psychological ramifications of having had sex with this person in an unconsensual way. So I'd rather just like not even try and bring it up, because I know like he's not going to do it. And then obviously in hindsight, if you're already feeling like that about someone, it's not a good person to have sex with. But yeah, a lot of us like end up in these kind of situations, and then it's like it's I also think like because so many sexual positions make it so easy for men to be the ones stealthing as opposed to us, because like I don't know, the time I had where a man like took off a condom during sex without asking me, I was like in doggy position, and and like all these positions that enable them to be able to do that without like asking consent. And I don't know, and I really agree with what you were saying, Nicole, about like just an added layer of emotional labor that needs to be done, like, as if we don't already have so much emotional labor. Now we've also got to think about okay, how we're going to do this contraception, how we're going to make sure that like this functions well, and have these conversations around this. And meanwhile, for men, they never have to like they're generally taught not to think about it at all. Like most of them don't really know what the pill is, or like, well, they know what it is, but are not going to do the research, are not going to really understand like how birth control or the cycle or all of that works. It's just like completely left up to us. It's very frustrating.
And I mean, like the trauma of like stealthing is so like what a complete violation, you know. And I'm really, really happy. We shouted this out on Positive Leftness News recently that in Canada, stealthing was just like decided that it constitutes rape and sexual assault. So like, thank God that like we're starting to recognize that. But I mean, the fact that you know, that's not an uncommon experience is like just horrifying, really.
Absolutely. And I also like this, like wonder to what extent like the widespread acceptance of the pill was just like a result of like men not wanting to wear condoms, and like suddenly it's like a way for them to not have to wear condoms, because if their partners are on the pill, then they're like, oh yeah, like now I don't have to do this. And usually for most of us, it's more ingrained in us that like the fear of pregnancy as opposed to STDs. At least for me, I'm like way more scared about pregnancy than STDs. And and so it can be easy to like to have sex without condoms in that kind of situation.
Well, and I think that's like very political too, in the realm of heterosexual relationships versus like I would say gay men specifically, you know, because for them STDs are a big fear and have been historically. Whereas, and I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I think the AIDS scare or the AIDS epidemic made straight people feel even more safe in terms of STDs, STIs. So I feel like it really enhanced this focus of heterosexual sex is about pregnancy and gay sex is about STDs, you know, and so, and I think that still perpetuates today. Like I have never talked to a straight person who's ever thought about getting HIV/AIDS, ever. I've never met a single straight person who's ever said that was like a thing they even ever considered. So I think I think that kind of partially answers the question we've had going of like, why are men putting themselves at this risk too, you know? And I think that's a big part of it. And I have heard people say like, well, whatever I'm going to catch, I can just go take some penicillin, or I can go, you know, take whatever medication and clear it up. And so it's not a big deal. And they just never even seem to consider that they could catch something that would be a bigger deal. Now, granted, HIV AIDS has become more treatable and much better managed nowadays. We have like much better treatment for it. So it doesn't have to be the same kind of death sentence that it was before. But still, it's not that. It's not an awareness of treatment options, which are still, you know, pretty, like, it's a pretty intense thing to do compared to a different STD where you can just kind of take a pill and clear it up. But it's not an awareness of the fact that treatment options have gotten more effective and better. It's that like, oh, I'm straight, so that's not going to happen to me. And I think that really does come out of homophobia and this focus. And, you know, we have monkeypox now, like, what did they say? Same tune, different song or something, whatever that expression is. But it's like the same thing over and over again, where it's like these things are only affecting this one community. So if you're not part of that community, you're safe and you don't have to worry about it. And I think we see that with the way that straight cis men go treat STIs.
Yeah. And it's also like, I think it also allows like cis women then to also kind of feel like that, yeah, they're safe. Like, well, I'm on the pill, so it's okay if we don't use a condom.
Yeah. I've had so many friends say that, who literally have like one night stands and stuff. And I'm like, what do you do about condoms? Because I also, my big thing always is blowjobs too, because I'm like, well, you can get an STI from a blowjob. So I always ask my friends, I'm like, who say they have safe sex. I'm like, what do you do about blowjobs? Because I always find that really awkward. And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, oh, okay. So you're not. But anyway, I've had friends who like, you know, have a lot of very casual sex. And when I ask about like safe sex or like what they do, because I'm always curious, you know, they're like, oh, I'm on the pill. And I'm like, well, honey, that's not, I mean, that's just one, that's just one thing, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that, it's very normalized for cishet women to be like, well, I'm not going to get pregnant, so it's a big deal.
Yeah, like, I definitely learned that the hard way, because I was like in my late teens or whatever, and like had this like, you know, short-term relationship with this guy who actually had a girlfriend and was also sleeping with other people that I didn't know about. And so I, you know, was like, well, I'm on the pill, and like we just never really even considered that. So I ended up getting chlamydia, which, like, you know, I had no symptoms of. The only reason I knew was because, like, I guess at my physical, my doctor told me, and luckily, you know, I could take a pill for 7 days and then that was fine and whatever. But I mean, yeah, that definitely woke me up, because like it could have been anything. I just think it gives people this kind of like false sense of security that like, yo, this is what I'm doing, as you said, for safe sex and whatever. But just, I'm truly shocked by like how many, you know, cis straight men just don't even consider STIs at all.
Yeah. And there's, you know, things like HPV, which can affect anybody, but I think, I don't have the stats, but I think, you know, is more of an issue for people with, I know it can affect your cervix specifically. I don't know if it affects other stuff. You know, it's like tied into cervical cancer. Where was I going with that? Which I had HPV for a couple years until my body cleared it. And so that's another thing that you can be left with, or that you can get, where it's like, I can't like take a pill and get rid of this, and my body might be able to deal with it, but it also might turn into cancer. And that's like a really, but people don't think long term, right? They think like, oh, is my pee burning in a couple days or a week or two. Or am I pregnant? You know, they don't think like, oh, years from now, this could turn into cervical cancer for the person that I'm sleeping with. And for a long time, I don't know if it's changed now, but, you know, they had the HPV vaccine that was only given to teenagers with wombs. And there was not testing for like AMAB people. So even though they could carry it and give it to people, it was like, again, the burden was just put on people with vaginas basically to get vaccinated and have to like avoid this risk, basically. I think that that's changed, but I'm young enough to remember when the vaccine came. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the vaccine came out. And that's what it was. It was like being given to, you know, teenage girls, quote unquote. And there was like, I remember when I got HPV, I was like, well, and you know, in defense of guys too, I asked my doctor, I'm like, well, does my boyfriend need to do anything or know anything? Like, should he get screened? And he was like, no. And that was it. He didn't give me any other information. And it's like, well, like, you know, like, should we be having safer sex, or like what should we do? And he was kind of like, well, if you have it, he probably has it, but like it's hard to screen for men, and he's probably, it just was so blasé. And I was like, okay, but I have a fucking fine. I know, it's like I have an STD and now I have to go tell my boyfriend, and like I have no information for him and his safety. That feels really fucked up. Like I have no answers for him. Anyway, and someone in the comments pointed out that herpes is very common and not treatable. And to that I say, correct. And this plays into the politics of who looks like they have an STD, which is something I hear a lot. And that was part of that vegan guy's post. When he was saying he sleeps with low risk people, that was kind of part of it. Coded in there was like people who look clean.
Oh my God.
So people think like, oh, if you have something I can catch, I'm going to be able to tell by looking at you. And I think herpes falls under that. Like they think like you're going to have a breakout, or you're going to have some visible sign that I can see, or you're going to come off to me as a person who has an STI, and I'll be able to tell. You know, and so then I can avoid you. So that's a great point, because herpes is extremely common and no one ever fucking thinks about it. And I've actually been made to seem like I'm being cruel or overly cautious or whatever, because I tend to not like to share silverware or glasses, drinks, you know, things with other people. And I'm made out to be like a prude or something. And it's like, well, I have a very low immune system. And so I know that there's a lot that I can catch, you know, through someone else's saliva. So I'm not someone who wants to be in a crowd of people, like sharing all these things. I'm not judging other people who do, but it's just like, I just don't want to for myself. And like a lot of people take offense to that. Even people who I know have oral herpes, and they still get mad at me for not wanting to share silverware with them. And I'm like, but I'm just trying to protect myself. Like I have enough, I have a lot that I'm dealing with, and it's just something I try to do, you know, even just from other people's germs. Like it's a balance, but it's like, I don't want to literally consume your spit if you're not someone I'm close to, because then I'm exposing myself to more germs than I need to, you know? So it's like something I do to protect my health, but people get really upset about it. And I think the reason I'm talking about this at length is because I think it translates well over into sex. Like if someone's going to get mad at me for not sharing a fork, you know what I mean? Like they're probably going to be someone who's going to get mad at being made to wear a condom or whatever. Like the way that we view each other's health and boundaries and consent crosses over to more than just like P and V sex, you know, it crosses over into a lot of different areas. a lot of different sexual acts, a lot of different sexualities, but also just day-to-day behavior, like how normal it is for people to share drinks and silverware and, you know, whatever else. I can't tell you how many times I've had a friend who's like half licked a spoon of ice cream and then it's been like, oh, do you want to try it? And I'm like, no. Do I want to eat your spitty spoonful of ice cream? Absolutely not. And that marks me as like a weirdo. But it's like, you know, it's, again, I don't blame people for being like social and not really caring. That's fine. But it shouldn't be weird for me to be thinking about, we're exchanging fluids. I know you're thinking about it as like we're sharing ice cream, but I'm saying like we are actually exchanging fluids, and I'm going to think about that in terms of my health and safety before I say yes or no. If you're someone whose tongue I'm sucking on all the time, sure, still wipe the spoon off. Don't give me a half-eaten spoon of ice cream. It's weird. And that's my autism talking. But, you know, like if you're someone that I'm not really physically, like I've had people do it when I've just met them. You know, maybe I'm meeting like a partner's group of friends, and it's like within 5 minutes, someone's like, here, try my drink and eat this. And I'm like, I don't even, you know, I haven't even like given you a hug. We're not even at that level. I don't want to do it.
Yeah, especially since the pandemic.
Yeah, well, that was the most validating thing to ever happen to me.
Yeah.
Because I was like, see? Like, this is why I don't want to share silverware with all of you. But yeah,
people
like,
still do it, and I'm like, really?
I know. It's wild to me. But yeah, and I think the pandemic, someone brought up the pandemic before too, in terms of like people not wearing masks. And then also wondering if there's a crossover between people who don't wear masks and people who don't wear condoms.
Yeah.
And I think COVID is actually a really good example of this is not an STI, but it is a disease of, you know, contact and proximity, and to see how lightly the majority of people took it and still take it, you know, and I think you can apply that to sex and see like, well, yeah, it makes sense that in this culture that we have where illness is not taken seriously and everyone thinks they're invincible, and they also think they can tell who's sick, that people are not going to take your personal boundaries seriously, and they're just going to believe that they can do things and get like not have any consequences. Especially if they feel like they're what's the word I'm looking, if they're like outsourcing what they perceive to be the most severe consequences to the other person, right?
Yeah.
And I would love to hear, I know this is about birth control, so it doesn't really apply, but, you know, I would think, and, you know, learning about like bottom culture and things like PrEP, you know, I wonder if similar things are happening there, where it's like, if you're a bottom, you're expected to be on PrEP and like maybe not use a condom, and that's, you know what I mean? Like I could see similar dynamics popping up in other communities as well.
Yeah.
The people who get penetrated have to carry the burdens of the top who dick us down.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. There's like, even with others, so like if you use a strap-on, you're supposed to use a condom with it. I don't know if people know that, but like there's a lot of ways that, you know, safe sex permeates, and I've been very interested in having very safe sex with people of all genders and, you know, genitalia, and I've read a lot of stuff of like lesbians, for instance, laughing about dental dams and being like, I would never use one of those. I'd rather get an STI. And it's like, woof, you know, as someone who would want to be very safe, especially if I'm going to get to have my hoe phase like I fantasize about, that's really hard to read. It's hard to read that like I might be left out of a room, you know, for being like, hey, can we be super safe?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. And yeah, I do think, like, back to your media point, that like none of that helps, you know, it's just like not normalizing any of this and making it kind of like a joke and gross and a mood killer and whatnot. Anyway, does anyone have anything else to add before? I thought we could maybe talk about like what are some other potential options that could be better.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one final point about how the ads that promote birth control are often like incredibly patriarchal and based on loads of gender stereotypes, where often it's marketed like take the pill and you'll become less hormonal, or it would help you deal with acne, or I know you're going to get bigger boobs. Oh my God, that was a massive one for me. As someone who's a part of the itty bitty titty committee, I was a big reason for going on the pill was because people told me like, oh, I get bigger boobs from that. And it was like part of the marketing was like, oh, you're going to get bigger breasts. And then, yeah, like all these ideas of like moodiness, anxiety, irritability, bloating, like that these things will reduce these things. And it's just, like it's just sad when the marketing of these things, especially if you're like an impressionable teenager and you're like really body conscious, or you don't want to, I know you don't want to be fat, so you think, oh, okay, this is like one way to reduce bloating. But also it seems like some of those things seem very sexist, because it's like we're often told that we're the irrational, hormonal, overly emotional ones, and it's like, oh, this is a pill that can make me more of a cool girl that doesn't, so I don't like fall into that like traditional gender trap of emotionality and stuff. So yeah, I think the ads can be really patriarchal.
Yeah, and of course, like they say all that stuff, like, you know, in a high-pitched voice, and then they just quietly whisper, like, "Oh, it can also make you gain weight and like and kill your libido, and oh yeah, you could have a stroke and die." But yeah, you know, like all of like the super long list of side effects that are extremely severe and like completely actually contradict some of the stuff that you were saying like about bloating, because like I know that that was one thing that I was told, that it was like, oh well, you could gain 10 pounds just by starting the pill, and I'm like, great, you know. They just, you know, say that at a whisper, like at the end of the ad, you know.
I also think it's so interesting to me, like the cultural differences in birth control, which like I guess it should be like, it's kind of like an obvious statement, of course there'd be cultural differences, but should it be that normal that, I don't know, I guess at this point I would think that most of us would have like very similar types of birth control between nations, because if there's like so many years and like so much testing that we should have like the most approved or whatever. But like the shot one, for example, maybe it exists in the UK, but I've never heard of like the 11-week shot thing. And
Really?
I have a friend from Slovakia, and her form of birth control is like this thing that you spray in your vagina, and it's like kills the sperm. But she lived in the UK with me, and we were trying to find some of that for her in the UK, and it did not exist. And on the NHS website, it also wasn't like available as even a thing, and so she had to go back to Slovakia to get some. But I don't know, I just thought it was so interesting that like that, yeah, that there's so, and also the pill has so many different names. I think like a lot of the pills are the same, but they're just named differently based on who owns it or whatever. But yeah, I don't know, is that interesting to you, or does it just seem obvious?
No, I think it is interesting, because I never heard of that spray thing.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is, but yeah, I do think it's interesting, because especially in the US, I don't know how it is in other countries. Like I imagine it's similar in Canada, maybe in the UK, but the advertising is just so constant, you know, so you're just constantly aware that these things exist and what the supposed benefits are. So there's a big drive, like the Depo-Provera shot, which is what I was on, was such a huge thing, because it's like, oh, you just take this shot, then you don't have to worry about it for like 11 or so weeks, and you, for most people, stop getting your period. And it like sounded like a magical thing. And it was advertised, it was like commercials for it constantly, you know. So you're just like so hyper aware. Also, Kathrin, you're that makes me think of the Seinfeld episode, the Spongeworthy
Yeah.
episode,
What
Because
is
I
I
think,
don't think I've seen it.
oh God, it was so funny. It's just like, were they discontinuing sponges or it was
Yeah,
just
yeah.
yeah, I think they're back though. I think you can get sponges now. I feel like I looked it up a while ago. Anyway, it sounds like a similar thing where it's this like sponge that you put inside you and it has spermicide on it. So you put it in like, you know, within an hour of having sex or something. And it was this character, Elaine's like favorite birth control, and they were discontinuing it. So she only had so many left.
Mhm.
So her and her friend were like constantly talking about if this guy was like sponge worthy or not, if he was like worth using a sponge on. Anyway. But yeah, and that's the thing too, is like, I don't know if sponges, Mexie, I know you're going to bring up a diaphragm, which I'm interested to hear about, but I feel like these things were never, like, no one ever talked to me about these alternatives ever.
Yeah.
So it's kind of wild to me, especially like Kathrin, what you were saying, you know, I've been in similar situations being in like long distance relationships or just being in between partners for a very long time. And it's like, if I had known that there were things I could just use in the moment and then not have to be on anything, I would have definitely opted for that. But nobody talked to me. Like, I remember thinking as a teenager or like a young adult that a diaphragm just seemed like a 1950s thing that like seemed like it couldn't possibly work, and just did not feel like it was, like, no one had ever told me that was an option or talked to me about it. And now I'm like, oh, that actually sounds like a great solution. But like, it was never presented to me as a solution.
Yeah.
And the only time I had heard, this is the last thing I'll say, the only time I had heard about a diaphragm was in Look Who's Talking, I believe, when they show the diaphragm not working in the beginning. And is it Kirstie Alley in that movie getting pregnant? So even my only awareness of it was like, oh, they don't work, you know?
Right. So I actually don't know why that was a mess up. I meant to write IUD. I don't know why I wrote diaphragm.
Oh, I was so excited.
I know.
Although IUDs are very cool as well.
Yeah, no, I meant to say that I had an IUD. Like, I'm pregnant now, and I wanted to be pregnant, so I took it out purposefully. But yeah, the IUD was what I was using for, I don't know, 6-7 years. Non-hormonal, which I mentioned before. But yeah, I would like to learn more about diaphragms, because I do remember them being talked about in like sex ed class in, you know, grade school. But for some reason, it's just, I don't know if it's advertising or what, but for some reason, or maybe they are less effective than you know, others. Like, I don't actually know, but yeah, for some reason, like, some of
they
these
should be more effective, right? The IUD.
No, I'm talking about diaphragms.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, IUDs are very effective. I don't know about diaphragms. Maybe we can like quickly Google it, but yeah, for some reason, like, some forms of birth control get more, you know, normalized and stabilized in society than others. And I'm sure there's like a whole political economy to that. But yeah, you're right. It's like, why can't we just do more of these kind of like individual kind of interventions and not have, you know, decades long hormonal disruption and all the rest that comes with it?
Yeah. And I mean, you know, if you're in a situation where for whatever reason you're not going to use a condom, then knowing and having access to these other options that's what I was saying before too, is like, that is actually liberating, right? Versus like telling everyone that there's only this one option for them and that they have to do it. And it's this thing that, yeah, I mean, it makes total sense to me why hormonal birth control is the only thing that's really pushed, because it's on a prescription basis. You have to keep getting it. So it's an industry. Whereas like a diaphragm or an IUD or whatever, you're only buying one of them. You're only getting one of them, you know, for a very long period of time. You might only get one in your lifetime, depending on, you know, the timing of it. So yeah, it's all capitalistic, that they're trying to get us onto things that we have to keep getting over and over and paying money for, whether ourselves or through our insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I wanted to just touch briefly on like fertility awareness method, because I know that they bring that up in the documentary. And this is something that I'm definitely much more interested in now. And honestly, like I did not start learning about my cycle until like a year ago. Until my mid 30s, solidly. And really, I only started to look into that. I mean, after like, hearing about period power and then kind of diving into that. And then, trying to actually get pregnant and thinking about fertility, I was like, oh, let's actually pay attention to this. And it's actually, yeah, enraging that they don't actually just teach this in school and this isn't more common knowledge. But now that I'm actually understanding like fertility and the cycle and everything, I am really interested in I guess tracking. I mean, I can't now, but like when I have a cycle again, really tracking and getting to know my cycle. And so, yeah, I mean, the whole fertility awareness method is basically that there's, a limited number of days in every month where you are likely to get pregnant. I mean, there's like a small chance that you could get pregnant outside of that. And so like, you need to be aware of that as well. But typically there's, a handful of days that you are quite likely to get pregnant. And so on those days, you can think about like more shorter term kind of interventions like condoms or diaphragms or the spray or whatever, right? Whatever you kind of decide with your partner. And then outside of that, you can decide if you want to use birth control or not, or if you want to, time things accordingly. And so obviously there are risks associated, right? Like if like you miscalculate or, there is still a small chance that you could get pregnant outside of that window. Which is why it's always really important to have like abortion access completely available as well. Because yeah, I think the producer of the documentary was saying this on a podcast as well, that like this is also quite cultural, where in a lot of places like fertility awareness method might be more of the norm or whatever, but then it kind of is coupled with this idea that like, well, we could get an abortion if that is necessary, kind of thing. And not to like, because people get mad that it's like, oh, you're just falling back on that, and it's just like, well, no, like you're doing your absolute best. But like in the case that anything happened, like you do need to know that like you'll be okay and that like there are other options, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I used it for years. I had really good success with it. I had the help of I think especially now that there are so many apps where you can track your cycle and you can track other measurements of where you are in your cycle, like cervical fluid and basal body temp. There's also devices that you can get. They're fairly expensive. They mentioned one of them at the end of the documentary, but the lady comp, don't even get me started about the name, which I guess now they have a device called Daisy, but they used to have the lady comp and the baby comp. So you would use the lady comp to not have a baby and the baby comp to have a baby. But they were these really incredible, very sophisticated devices that were also very expensive. So not, accessible to everyone. But if you were paying for birth control and you could afford to, you would save money over time using this instead. Which is kind of like how I approached it when I went off birth control. I was like, okay, this is going to cost me like so many months of what my birth control would have cost. But then after that, it's actually saving me money. Anyway, it helps you take your basal body temp and it tracks your cycle. And it's said to be like 99% effective with correct use. So, and there's a lot of things that can happen. Like I had a friend who ended up ovulating twice in her cycle. And she was self-tracking. And so she ended up getting pregnant. And fortunately they had they wanted a kid anyway. They were going to wait a little bit longer. So it ended up not being like too big of a deal. that she got pregnant, but there's a lot that can happen. People can, their cycles can get messed up because of stress. There's just like, I know for myself, I'm an insomniac, so it's very hard for me to take my basal body temp upon waking at the same time every day, because that time is always different. And like, who knows how much sleep I actually got. So my temperature, might be messed up. But even with that, I found it very effective. And a lot of times, if you're using a device like that, it can really help you know, like if you were ovulating twice, it would probably pick up on that through different metrics that it's taking. So I just want to put it out. It's like, it is, I think, overall a very effective method, but it is also a lot of work, and it requires you to be very consistent. Like, you have to take your temp at the same time. You have to, like, you're supposed to, like, ideally someone would like come stick the thermometer in your mouth while you're still sleeping. So it's like, you can't take a sip of water. You really like shouldn't even like yawn too much. I mean, it's pretty intense. It can be to get like that level of accuracy. So it is also pretty labor intensive. And there's other things you can do like tracking your cervical fluid, but that again requires you to like, touch up there and then like analyze, what is it? Is it slippery? Is it eggy? Is it, and that to me, I'm like, I don't want to do all that work.
I also could never decide. I'm like, I don't know. Is it eggy? Is it slippery? Like, what do you think slippery is?
Same. I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah. Like, I guess it's clear, or is it white? I can't like assess this. So
Celeste asks, can you take your temp anally? I don't know. Actually, that's a pretty good question, because that would be more accurate. I know that the thermometer on the lady comp that I was using was not built for that. It was extremely delicate, and it was built to, specifically get like your under your tongue temperature. But it does seem like a thing that should work, honestly. Anyway, so I just wanted to put that out there. And then it's the sort of thing where it gives you a window that should keep you safe of when to start being careful. So it gives you like probably 5 days before you could get pregnant. It's like, hey, start being safe now. So I do think in conjunction with other birth control methods, it can be very effective, and it can be very empowering. And I've known a lot of like cishet men who get involved in the tracking and kind of get excited about it and like start to know more where you are in your cycle. So it can be kind of a nice thing to do together. But it is a lot of work, and I think that makes it hard. And I think anytime something's not being done correctly, right, it immediately gets less effective. So it's an option I think people should look into, but it's also something I would totally understand if someone was like, that's not going to work for me. And I would understand why it may have not worked for other people.
Yeah, I think it also kind of, it's only really works if you're quite regular, right? Because like for me, some of my periods are every 3 weeks, some of them are every 6 weeks. And then I'm like, would it then give me like an accurate reading of the situation? Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, it's very,
I found tracking like really empowering in terms of it. Just, I understood, like I had so much data on what was happening in my body at all times, and that was really cool. Like my body temp was pretty low, and I had always felt like my body temp was low, but then seeing it time after time, and then I started to do some things to try to address that, and then they started to work. And so I was seeing like my temp go up gradually over time, and it was like, this is cool. It made it kind of neat to have that much like insight into my own body and like what was happening. And I found it to be very accurate. Like every time it said I was going to start my period, I started my period. I found it to be spot on for me. But again, I was very privileged that like I was able to have access to this device at the time. I think when you're tracking by hand and really relying on things like your cervical fluid more, because I didn't even track that. I just went by my temp and my, cycle and stuff. I think that definitely makes it a bit more tricky and a lot more work. If you have a day where you just don't want to do it,
Yeah.
it's a little tough.
I really love that idea because, as I was saying earlier about the whole period power thing, about like knowing what period of your cycle you are in, because then from that you can have more knowledge about what is good to do at that time. And yeah, like it's a lot of lost wisdom that we used to have much more of, and like witches and things paid a lot of attention to. Yeah, so I could imagine for myself, not as like necessarily as a contraception, but something just to like have that self-knowledge would be amazing. And especially if your partner got on board with it, because then they'd be much more receptive to like knowing, oh, okay, you're at this stage, you're probably feeling like this, let me accommodate to you. So yeah, I love it. I might get that.
I think you would really like it.
Yeah.
Just from I know you like moving with your cycle and stuff, and it just gives you like that much more insight into your cycle. I think it's really cool.
Nicole, I think you also said at the beginning that you had like controversial opinions about pull-out method or something.
Oh, jeez.
But you don't have to go into it.
Yes. So, okay, I looked it up, and a diaphragm used perfectly is 94% effective.
Okay.
Typical use, real life use, is about 87%, which is pretty good for what it is. That's kind of a high risk. It's not, 87% sounds like a lot, but when you think about all the people, all of the times, it's not that great. So basically it means that 13 out of 100 people who use a diaphragm the way that it's typically used will get pregnant each year.
Yeah.
So, and you can do things with the diaphragm, like you can use spermicide with it, and that will make it more effective. So you do have some options. A lot of people, however, find spermicide very irritating. That's one of the things that I find in condoms that have it can be a bit irritating for me. So there's that. They say put your diaphragm in before you start having sex, even before you're aroused, if possible. So it's something you want to do like ahead of time. And then you need to get to know, like, your diaphragm needs to be covering your cervix. So you want to make sure you just like know how to make sure that it's in the right position. Okay, so that's that. So what else did I look up earlier? So condoms are 98% effective if used perfectly. But the typical rate is, wait for it, also 87%.
Oh, really?
Yes. So this is why finding the right condom size is very important, and then knowing how to put it on properly is very important. You want to pinch the tip and roll it down and make sure that it's rolled down properly and that you don't have bubbles anywhere, because with friction those can rupture. And I think it was Paul pointed out in the chat, like if you have a condom that's too small, that can lead to tearing as well. You want to make sure that the other person's properly, or you or the other person is properly lubricated, because that can also lead to tearing if, that's just too much dryness and too much friction happening that way. So all of that can get you more up to the 98%. And then, yes, my hot take. So this may shock people, but pull-out method is 96% effective when done properly. This is a huge caveat, because typical use of pull-out method is 78% effective, which is not good. And I have several friends who have gotten pregnant from pull-out method. So the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I think people are afraid to talk about pull-out method because it's kind of like, everyone's like, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And I understand that, but I also think that we should give people all the tools to make decisions for themselves in the moment. And so if you have someone perhaps who's being pressured into sex without a condom, but they can talk their partner into pulling out, it's going to give them better protection than if they didn't have it. Or if you have two people who are in a situation where they're like, we're going to fuck, like it's going to happen, we're going to do it unprotected. So if they make the option to pull out, then at least it's giving them something. I think it's good. I think people are afraid to educate people because then they'll just choose that thing. But I think we need to give people information and let them make their own choices. So again, with typical use, pulling out is only 78% effective. The way that you can increase this and get it more towards perfect use. Now, of course, the biggest thing, which is very hard to control for, is the person with the penis knowing their body well enough to know when that time is that they can pull out before they start to come. And I think this is where most people go wrong. And, you know, the person who's being penetrated has no control over that. So that's difficult, right? That's scary. Like you can't really control that. If you are the person with the penis, practicing masturbating and getting to know when that time is really helpful. Another thing that no one ever talks about is if you have come at any time prior to the sex that you're having, you need to urinate to empty out your tube of all sperm and to like make it acidic so that it kills off anything that might be in there. So if you've come previously either from masturbating or maybe, you know, we're fooling around and like got off in some other way and now you're going to have penetrative sex, then you need to make sure that you go to the bathroom and also that you wash yourself off really well to make sure that anything that might be on the outside and on the inside is washed away. And that's going to really help a lot. So Mama Nic is not saying to do it, but I'm saying, and I'm going to remind you, I have several friends who've gotten pregnant from pullout method, but what I will say is that it has worked for me. I have used it and it has worked for me. And I think if it's the only option you have, now you have information on how to do it in the best way.
Yeah.
Do that what you will.
And you could also combine that with fertility awareness, or even like, you know, we're just talking about a diaphragm. So maybe that's only 87% effective, but then you have a diaphragm plus the pullout method. And then maybe that's preferable for you and your partner. So like there are a lot of different options that you can mix and match. And it's really about like, having the information, which we don't have. We didn't have any of this information. Like we just got it just now. But yeah, question about that. Cause I know some people say like, oh, but you can get pregnant from the pre-cum as well, which like
from my understanding, and I've looked this up several times, there is no sperm in pre-cum.
Okay.
So it has the ejaculation, that whole physical process of ejaculating is what moves the sperm out. So the pre-cum is just this like lubricant that doesn't have sperm in it.
That's really interesting. I didn't know.
Okay. But it is, I mean, other things to consider are, you know, sometimes, and I've been guilty of this because I'm a dirty little bird, but sometimes someone will pull out and then come on the person's, you know, vagina or genital region. And that is dangerous because it like literally can just take a drop to get in there and cause trouble. So that's something is like you really want to angle yourself away and make sure wherever you're coming, it's far away from that person's genitals, you know, on their chest maybe, or like away into a sock perhaps. I don't know your life. Do what you want to do. So that's a big thing. And then, also, I think you have to be really careful afterwards because you now have cum all over your hand. The other person potentially has cum, you know, on their body somewhere. So you have to be really careful that you don't like start fooling around again. I think sometimes when it dries, you can kind of forget if you're kind of laying around, or even if you wash up, but you're not washing up like you're not taking a shower, you know, so maybe you miss something. It can be really easy to, can you tell I like to fuck several times a night? It can be really easy to kind of get back into things and then forget like, oh shit, maybe I had a little bit of sperm left on my finger, you know, and now I'm touching this person. So I think those kinds of things, I hate having to be overly clean when it comes to sex. Like I don't like the idea of having to run right into a shower, but it's just something like if things are starting to heat up again and you've sort of gotten cum everywhere, then you may want to take a shower before you proceed, because, you know, it's like you have this ticking time bomb that you can't see anymore all over you, and it could get into the womb and create some trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just keeping that in mind is like, it can be a tool. It is, if you are going to use it, it is good to use it in combination with other things. For me, it worked really well in combination with the fertility awareness method.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew, you know, I have a very low chance of getting pregnant, so we might as well do this, and that's fine. And, you know, in a monogamous relationship, which may or may not matter, but for me, it was like, okay, I don't really have the STI risk, so I feel like this is okay. My partner and I had talked about like getting an abortion if something did happen, so we had that conversation. And then on those days where you're at risk of getting pregnant, then you use a condom, or you abstain, or do other things. You know, you just do something that's a bit more careful, and that works really well. It also works really well with condoms, but you know, good luck getting people to do that. But it is very effective if you use condoms to also pull out.
How would that work? So you would
just as like you're starting to climax, you would pull out and either come into the condom or take it off and then come wherever you're going to come.
Okay.
Some people like it because it keeps it really clean. You know, some people actually do prefer doing that. And it's really good because it's helpful against STIs as well as pregnancy. It's really effective. But again, it's a matter of what you and your partner want to do. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. No, this is important. This is really important. Like, yeah, there are so many options out there. It doesn't just have to be the birth control pill. And for some reason, we've just fallen to that option for literally everything under the sun. But it's very harmful and has very pernicious gendered effects. Or I guess not gendered, but like, yeah, based on whatever, if you have a womb or not. Yeah, it's really not okay for this, all this information to be kept from us, because then we can't actually make informed choices about that. And that's the most important thing, I believe, is like communication with your partner and making really informed choices about this. And so hopefully we've helped you in some way today to, make those informed choices and just feel more empowered doing it. And I honestly can't believe that it's taken me till like my mid-30s to like fully actually understand all of this, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it was same for me. It was like early 30s before I even knew any of this stuff.
Yeah.
So
can I just say one other suggestion maybe is to keep some kind of like mood journal for the type of contraception that you're taking. And it doesn't just have to be with like if you're taking the pill and then seeing how you feel, but also I found like journaling and like keeping a mood journal for how I was feeling when I was using a condom or when I was using a pull-out method, or like when I was having sex around ovulation, or like things like that were really helpful for me, because I started to realize that, okay, I'm having like pull-out sex and it's working in terms of I'm not getting pregnant, but I'm not enjoying the moment very much because I'm just feeling like anxious, and I'm also just like every single time it's my period time, I'm getting so nervous that I'm not and then I'm like running to get a pregnancy test and take so many pregnancy tests and blah, blah. And so like clearly this isn't working for me. So I think that, and sometimes it can be hard to like really realize how like anxiety inducing something might be, or how it doesn't have to be anxiety, or how it's affecting you in general, because like the moments are so brief and then you go about your day. But yeah, I definitely found it helpful to have that. And also, if I could have had that when I first started the pill, I probably would have got off it a lot quicker. I wish like young people were empowered to like start tracking their moods when they took things like the pill, or made any kind of big changes in general. And so yeah, I think that could be helpful. And just to reiterate, I think something that we were saying as well, like reproductive or like birth control justice is holistic, and it's just like having access to food, shelter, money, so that you can also pay for abortions, access to parental care, access to like, you know, just gender equality in general. Like, I don't know, I hate that it's always so reduced to this, one solution and one pill. And
yeah, it's a really, really good point. And before we sign off, I want to point out something. Paul was crunching the numbers yesterday on birth control methods. And so condoms being 98% effective over 1 year means they're 55% effective over 30 years. So if you're an old hag like me who's still out in the streets, it's good to know. So Paul's making the point that doubling up on methods can really make a difference over a lifetime of having sex. And I think that's a very good point. I think we think about, like, we hear these numbers. And so, because who else doesn't hear 98% think 100%? Yeah. Sorry for the motorcycle gang outside. So yeah, I think it's good to know that it's like over time, your odds of something happening are going to increase. So it's good to consider to have maybe like a multi-layered approach to the birth control that you're using, and also the STI protection that you're doing.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I didn't even think about that. Also, I find the whole typical thing really confusing, because I'm like, what do typical people do? This doesn't help me, 78% typical, but I don't know what the typical, I'm not in everyone's bedrooms. Like, I don't know what the typical, am I doing it the typical way? I mean, obviously you can know what is like the good way and then how much you're like doing the good way, but I find those statistics so frustrating.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm like, how do they know?
Yeah.
Like what perfect versus typical use is.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I think that's everything we've got birth control related. Now you're fully informed and you can take charge of your womb.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you both for this wonderful conversation.
Yes, thanks for hosting and organizing. This is such a good topic, I think, to cover.
Yeah.
It's so funny. I thought this would be a quick discussion.
I thought so too. It turns out
2.5 hours later. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and we'll see you next month.
Bye.
Oh, also we have a Patreon, and we don't have a single Patreon.
Give us money, Daddy.
I felt it's really sad that we don't have a single patron.
Well, to be fair, I'm sure everyone here like is already a patron of one of us. So.
I'm sure.
Thank you.
Every time
for that.
you successfully pull out, you have to come give us money. That's the rule. For every cum sock, you have to make a $1 donation.
I've never tried that, but I really want to now.
What, a cum sock?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, anytime you can, no fuss, no muss, I'm all about it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Thomas, aka Cranador. Yeah, everyone's probably already a patron, but we appreciate you all. And
sorry, I didn't want to put.
This is a message for future viewers when our channel goes up and they're catching up on our backlog, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I should pay them." Yeah, exactly. You never know. One of these streams is bound to take off someday. Yes, and then we'll be rich. Hell yeah! All right, y'all. Very good talk. Thanks everyone for coming. Bye. Thanks, Mexie, for hosting. Bye. Bye, guys. Bye.